The moment I am about to describe took place in the waiting room of a pediatric clinic on a Thursday afternoon, and it lasted less than 4 minutes. And in those 4 minutes, something shifted in the room that I felt before I understood it, and understood before I could explain it. I was sitting in the corner chair near the window with my daughter Mia, who had fallen asleep against my arm with the complete, trusting weight of a 6-year-old who has decided that wherever her father is safe enough to let everything go. And I was doing what I do in waiting rooms, which is watch the room without appearing to watch the room, which is a skill you develop when you spend a lot of time in waiting rooms with a child who has significant medical needs, and the specific quality of waiting that comes with that. There were 8 other people in the room, families, mostly, and in the far corner, in 2 chairs that were slightly separated from the others, in the way of people who have learned to create space around themselves, was a woman in her late 30s, and a little girl of about 7, who was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes moving around the room with the careful assessing watchfulness of a child who has learned to read visual information very thoroughly. The little girl looked at me. I looked at her. And then I raised my hands and I signed to her, across the waiting room, a simple greeting. "Hi, I like your shoes." And what happened to that little girl's face, and then to her mother's face, and then to the dynamic of that entire room, is the story I am about to tell you. So let me ask you this before I say another word. When was the last time you gave someone a gift they were not expecting, in a place they had stopped expecting gifts? Because what happened in that waiting room was not planned, and was not performed, and cost me nothing. And it turned out to be the beginning of something that changed everything. My name is Joseph, and I need to tell you who I am before I tell you what happened. Because who I am is the reason I was in that waiting room on that Thursday, and the reason I knew how to do what I did when I saw that little girl. I am 36 years old. I work as a maintenance technician at a hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is work that I do well, and that I have been doing for 7 years. And that I find meaningful in the specific way of work that is visibly necessary. The building works because people like me keep the building working. And when hospitals work without interruption, patients receive care without interruption, which is a chain of consequence that I find worth getting up for every morning. I do not make a great deal of money. I make enough, which is its own kind of sufficiency, and I manage it with the precision of someone who has learned that precision is the difference between enough and not enough, and who has no interest in learning that lesson repeatedly. I have a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that is perfectly safe and not particularly glamorous. I drive a car that runs reliably. I have what I need. I have been a single father for 5 years, since my wife Naomi died of a pulmonary embolism at 30 years old. 6 weeks after our daughter Mia was born, she was here and then she was not. Which is the only way I know how to say it that is accurate, because the medical explanation is correct but insufficient, and the emotional explanation has no words that do the full job. Mia has never known her mother except through the photographs I have kept at her eye level since she was tall enough to look at them, and the stories I tell her that are not performances of grief, but genuine reportage. Naomi laughing, Naomi making terrible puns, Naomi's specific and non-negotiable opinions about the correct ratio of cheese to everything else in a quesadilla, which I have honored faithfully in the 5 years since, because honoring the small specific things is how you keep a person present when they are gone. Mia is 6 years old and she is, in every way I know how to assess it, the most Naomi thing that has ever happened to me. She has her mother's laugh and her mother's precise opinions and a warmth that is entirely her own, but that has roots in something I recognized from before she was born. Mia was born with moderate bilateral hearing loss that was identified at birth, and has been managed since with hearing aids and audiology appointments and the specific network of support that hearing loss in a young child requires, and that I have navigated as a single parent, with the tenacity of someone who has decided that his daughter is going to have every tool available to her, regardless of the effort it takes to get those tools into her hands. The hearing aids help significantly. She attends a school that has a robust program for children who are hard of hearing. She speaks English fluently and reads lips with a skill that impresses her teachers. And she knows American Sign Language, which I began learning when she was 8 months old because I had decided, in the way I make most important decisions, which is quietly and absolutely, that my daughter's primary language was going to be a language I spoke fully, and that I was going to speak it fully by the time she needed me to. I have been learning ASL for 5.5 years. I am genuinely fluent in it now, in the way that a person who has practiced a language daily with someone they love becomes genuinely fluent. Not the fluent. of a native signer, but the fluency of a parent whose child needed this from him and who was not going to let her down. The Thursday of the waiting room was a routine audiology appointment, the kind we have every 3 months to track Mia's hearing and adjust the aids as needed. Mia likes these appointments because she likes her audiologist, Dr. Rena, who has been seeing her since she was 4 months old and who treats Mia with the specific professional respect of someone who understands that the patient in front of her is a person with opinions and preferences rather than a set of audiological readings to be processed. I like these appointments because they are evidence, concrete, measurable evidence that we are doing the right things and that the work we have put in is showing up in the data. We arrived at 2:30 for a 3 o'clock appointment, which meant 30 minutes in the waiting room, which is why I had time to watch the room and see the little girl in the corner. I want to tell you more about what I saw when I looked at that little girl before I tell you what I did, because what I saw is why I did what I did. She was approximately 7 years old, and a dress that was expensive in the specific way of clothes bought by people for whom expense is a default rather than a decision, and she had hearing aids in both ears that were newer and more technologically so. Sophisticated than Mia's, which I could see from across the room because I know hearing aids the way people who have spent 5 years learning about a specific piece of equipment know that equipment. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes doing the careful visual work of a deaf child, reading a room. Not unhappy, not distressed, just present and watchful in the specific way that children who depend on visual information learn to be present and watchful. The woman next to her was clearly her mother. Similar features, similar posture, and she was dressed in the way of someone for whom the clothes are simply the background of a professional life rather than a statement about it. She had a phone in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other, and the specific quality of someone whose attention is in 2 places simultaneously and who is managing this with the practiced efficiency of a person for whom divided attention is a permanent professional condition. She was present beside her daughter, and not entirely present beside her daughter, which I recognized as a thing that happens when the demands of a life are significant and the management of them is continuous, and the waiting room is simply another space in which the management continues. The little girl had been watching the room for about 10 minutes when she looked at me. She looked at me with the specific dire see-a-tennis of a deaf child who has not yet learned the hearing world's convention of looking away when eye contact has been made long enough. And I looked back at her with the same directness. And there was a moment between us of 2 people who speak the same language recognizing each other from across a room before a single word has been exchanged. I looked at Mia, who was still asleep against my arm. I looked back at the little girl, and I raised my hands and I signed, "Hi, I like your shoes." Her shoes were purple with small stars on them. They were objectively excellent shoes. What happened on her face in the next 2 seconds is something I keep coming back to when I think about why we learn the languages we learn, and who those languages belong to once we have built them. She looked at my hands. She looked at my face. She looked at my hands again with a specific checking of someone who is not yet sure whether they read that correctly, because reading it correctly would require that this stranger in the corner chair of a waiting room speaks her language, which is not what strangers in waiting rooms do. And then she realized she had read it correctly, and the realization moved through her entirely, in her face and her shoulders and her hands, which came up from her lap, and she signed back with the speed and the fluency of a native. "Thank you. How do you know sign language?" And I signed back with the particular warmth of someone who has had this conversation before and knows how good it feels from the other side. My daughter is hard of hearing. We learned together. She is sleeping right now. The little girl looked at Mia against my arm and then back at me and signed, "She is lucky." I signed, "I am luckier," and she smiled, the full, unguarded, completely real smile of a child who has been met where she is in a place where she was not expecting to be met. The mother had looked up. I want to describe what I saw on her face with care, because it is the center of the whole story. She had looked up from her phone when the movement of her daughter's hands changed from the still position to active signing, which is the movement a parent learns to notice, and she was looking at her daughter's face, and then at my hands, and then at her daughter's face again, and something was happening on her face that I was watching from across the room, and that I recognized from my own face in the early years. The specific expression of a parent watching their child be fully reached in the language that the world mostly does not speak to them. In the expression that is relief and gratitude and a kind of grief folded into each other in a way that cannot be easily separated. She was watching her daughter sign with a stranger in a waiting room with a wholehearted, and self-conscious joy of a child who has found something she was not expecting to find, and the watching was doing something to her face that I did not think she was aware of. She looked, in that moment, like someone who had put something down that she had been carrying for a while and had not realized how heavy it was until her hands were suddenly free. Now here is the moment I want to stop and be honest with you about, because this is where the story pivots and I want you inside it. The little girl and I had been signing for about 5 minutes. She had told me her name was Sophie and that her favorite animal was an octopus because they are smarter than most people think, which I told her I agreed with completely, and which Mia, who had woken up at some point in the middle of this exchange, confirmed with the authority of a 6-year-old who has very strong feelings about octopuses. And the mother had watched all of this without interrupting, with the specific quality of someone who is still processing what they are seeing and is not yet ready to do anything that might disturb it. And I was aware that at some point, I was going to need to decide whether to acknowledge the mother, whether to address the thing I had seen on her face, whether to reach across the room to her the way I had reached across the room to her daughter. The easy thing was to let it be what it was, a pleasant waiting room exchange between 2 children and a father who happened to speak the right language. The harder thing was to recognize that the mother's face had told me something and to respond to what it had told me. So I want to ask you right now, before I tell you what I did, what would you have done? You have just given a child an unexpected gift by speaking her language in a public place. You have watched the child's mother be moved by it in a way she may not know you can see. Do you acknowledge it? Do you speak to her? Do you say the thing that the situation has made available to say? Comment below and tell me honestly, because the choice in that moment is one I have thought about a great deal, and I want to know where you would have landed. Tell me, and then let me tell you what I chose. I looked at the mother and I signed, simply and directly, without the performance of casualness. She is wonderful. She told me about octopuses. The mother looked at my hands, then at my face, then at her daughter, then back at me. She said, aloud, which told me that she did not sign herself, or did not sign with confidence. You actually know sign language. I said my daughter and I learned together. She was born with hearing loss. The mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Sophie's father and we divorced 3 years ago. He learned sign language, and she stopped. She looked at Sophie, who was now signing something to Mia with the focused enthusiasm of someone who has found a peer. She said, I have been trying to learn. I take a class, but Sophie is so much faster than me and I feel like I am always. She stopped again. I said, behind. She said, yes. I said, that never goes away, actually. She will always be faster than you. That is not a failure. That is how it is supposed to work. She looked at me. I said, the point is not to catch up. The point is to be in the conversation, even when you are slower than she is. She knows the difference between a parent who is trying and a parent who has stopped. The mother was quiet for a long moment. Sophie had looked up briefly from her conversation with Mia and looked at her mother, and then at me, and then back at Mia with the expression of someone who has registered something significant and has decided to let it proceed. The mother said, how long did it take you? I said, to be comfortable. 2 years. To be good enough that Mia told me I was good? 3.5 years. She said, what did she say? I said, she said, Daddy, you sign like a real person now. The mother laughed. The real kind, the one that arrives before you have decided to laugh, and I heard the specific quality of relief in it that I recognized because I have laughed that way myself. Her name was Catherine Wee. Timor, she was 38 years old. She was the CEO of Woodmore Ventures, which is a venture capital firm in Charlotte that has invested in early-stage technology and healthcare companies for the past decade, and which she had built, I would learn later, from a small advisory practice into something that employed 40 people and that had a reputation in the investment community that was earned rather than inherited. She told me none of this in the waiting room. She told me her name, and that she took an ASL class on Tuesday evenings, and that Sophie had been born profoundly deaf, and that the 2 years following the diagnosis had been the most disorienting of her life, and that the divorce from Sophie's father, who was fluent and who had the ease with Sophie that fluency produced, had left a specific gap that she was working to close. I told her about Mia and about Naomi and about the 5.5 years of learning in the specific incremental daily way that you learn something that is both practically necessary and personally important. I told her about the moment Mia had signed to me. At age 2, "I love you" in the middle of dinner without any prompting, which I had to look away from because I could not let a 2-year-old see me cry, and which she had followed up with, "Are you okay, Daddy?" which made the looking away irrelevant. Catherine smiled at that one, a real sex. Smile, the kind that knows